She built a global empire from the alleys of Mushin. Politicians feared her. Agencies chased her. But no one ever caught the Queen of Shadows until she vanished.
In the heart of Mushin, Lagos, Nigeria, a place where the air sizzled with the buzz of okadas and the thick scent of street-cooked akara, Aisha Toriola was born on a stormy Tuesday night. Her mother, Alhaja Morayo, was a fierce woman who ran a roadside textile stall by day and whispered deals with market union bosses by night. Her father, whom Aisha only knew through a tattered photograph and bits of neighborhood gossip, had disappeared before she could walk. Mushin didn't forgive weakness, and Aisha learned to navigate its crowded alleys with eyes that missed nothing and hands that learned to hold secrets before they held pens. School was a blur of half days and hungry evenings. Aisha was bright, too bright for a place like Mushin, but poverty pulled at her uniform hem and hunger twisted her focus. By junior secondary 2, she had dropped out entirely, trading books for bolts of fabric and days in Balogun market. She watched the older women haggle and hustle, and from her mother, she learned a lesson no school could teach. Survival was the first education. And if you had charm, wit, and ruthlessness in equal measure, you could rewrite your fate, even if the ink was blood. Every evening, Aisha sat by her mother's side as deals were made over steaming bowls of yam porridge and bottles of star beer. There she picked up whispers of trucks that crossed borders at night, of goods that never saw customs, of women who were both respected and feared. She didn't know it yet, but Mushin wasn't just her birthplace, it was her crucible. And from its chaos, a queen would rise, not wrapped in royal robes, but in the shadows of ambition and crime.
By 16, Aisha Toriola had become a fixture in the markets of Lagos Island, known for her sharp tongue, striking beauty, and uncanny ability to close a sale. But it wasn't the fabric alone that earned her respect. It was the whispers of how she could smuggle cartons of cigarettes from Cotonou without once being stopped by customs. Her mother had opened that door years earlier, ferrying extra cargo under crates of textile goods. And now, Aisha was perfecting the art. What began as survival was becoming strategy, and in every market store, Aisha learned that profit always hid behind a curtain of risk. They called her Small Alhaja, mocking and admiring her at once. She was young, but moved with the quiet power of a seasoned trader. When other girls were learning to plait their hair or flirt with boys after mosque, Aisha was learning the names of border officers who could be bought and which boatmen were greedy enough to keep quiet. The road between Cotonou and Lagos was long and dangerous, but Aisha didn't fear it. She feared being poor more. One night, as they offloaded cartons from a rickety Peugeot van behind her mother's shop, her mother handed her a wad of damp naira notes and said, "If you can master people's greed, their fear won't matter." It was a lesson Aisha would carry into every room for the rest of her life. That night, a new thought took root in her mind, not just of earning money, but of controlling it. Not just surviving Lagos, but owning a piece of it. Cigarettes were just the beginning. Aisha had tasted power in the glint of hidden profit. And when the next opportunity came knocking, she would open the door wide, no matter what walked through. The invitation came wrapped in lace and laced with danger. Aisha was 19, draped in Ankara and thick gold, when she met Sister Tenny, a sharp-dressed woman with skin like polished cocoa and a British accent that caught attention like perfume. Tenny had watched Aisha close 3 deals in under an hour, haggling with men twice her age, eyes calculating, never blinking. Afterward, she approached her near the Molue bus stand with a question that would change her life. Have you ever thought about walking abroad? At first, Aisha laughed. The only abroad she knew was the Lagos Lagoon that separated her from Ikwe. But Tenny's offer wasn't about visas or university placements. It was about moving goods. Luxury items, she said with a wink, that only bold girls can carry. Aisha understood the code. Everyone in the market spoke it. The word luxury could mean anything from designer bags to pills packed into a body like a time bomb. Tenny said the money was triple what Aisha made in a month just for one trip. It was insane. It was impossible. It was irresistible. That night, Aisha sat alone on her mother's veranda, counting stars and thoughts. The air buzzed with generator hums and the soft hiss of frying plantains nearby. Could she really do it? One trip? Just one. With the money, she could move their store to a permanent shop, buy a generator, maybe even rent a small flat of her own. The fear inside her chest pulsed like a second heartbeat, but so did the hunger. 2 days later, she met Tenny again at a corner bar in Surulere. She wore black jeans and ambition. I'm ready, she said, not knowing she had just taken the first step down a path that would make her queen or kill her trying. The morning of her first shipment felt like stepping into someone else's life. Aisha stood in a hidden apartment in Festac town, surrounded by silence and shadows. Her stomach churned, not from fear, but from the pressure of 36 wraps of white powder that had been expertly packed and inserted inside her. She couldn't move too fast, couldn't laugh too hard, and couldn't even cough without feeling the shift of danger inside her. The women who prepared her were swift and clinical, former couriers turned handlers who offered no comfort, only reminders. Walk straight, don't look nervous, and whatever you do, don't drink water. Her flight was to Frankfurt, with a short layover in Amsterdam. Tenny had drilled the plan into her brain like scripture. From Murtala Mohammed Airport to Germany, she would meet a contact named Victor outside the arrival's gate. He would take her to a hotel where the wraps would be extracted. Her passport was fake, but good. Her name on paper was Janet Olamide Arowolo, a 23-year-old student from the University of Ilorin. She memorized the birth date, address, and fabricated student ID that matched. As she shuffled into the departure hall, every sound seemed louder, every face more suspicious. Her heart pounded with every step toward immigration. But when the officer looked at her passport and smiled, asking, "First time flying?" she forced a grin and said, "Yes, sir." He stamped her in, just like that. On the plane, every minute was a war between breath and panic. She didn't sleep, didn't eat, only stared at the emergency card in front of her and prayed silently. When the plane touched down in Germany, 12 hours later, Aisha felt reborn. But this new life, she was beginning to realize, came with a price she hadn't yet imagined.
The money came quickly in crisp euros wrapped in brown envelopes, thick enough to silence conscience. When Aisha returned from Germany a week later, she was $10,000 richer. Victor had been smooth, businesslike, his hotel room clean and sterile, the extraction brutal but professional. They gave her painkillers, watched her for a day, then handed her a ticket back home and an envelope stuffed with cash. She was told she had done exceptionally well. The praise thrilled her. So did the money. Back in Lagos, she didn't return to the market. Instead, she rented a 2-bedroom flat in Ogudu and gave her mother a new sewing machine, no questions asked. When the other market women whispered, Aisha just smiled and waved from the back of a tinted car. She began recruiting girls from the neighborhood, students, dancers, and single mothers desperate enough to risk everything for a piece of the dream. She was careful. Never too many trips, never the same route twice. She learned to manage risk like a chess player, every move planned 3 steps ahead. Her favorite careers were athletes, track stars with strong stomachs and clean records. She taught them how to carry the product, how to walk with innocence, how to lie with confidence. They were paid well. She made more. Her network began to expand. Benin to Lagos, Lagos to Paris, Johannesburg to New York. It was no longer just a hustle. It was a system. One afternoon, as she handed another brown envelope to a girl heading to Nairobi, Aisha looked at her and said, "You don't owe anyone the truth. Just get there and come back alive." It was advice she lived by. Lies could buy freedom if you were smart enough to remember every one of them.
The first time Aisha lost a career, she was in a high-rise hotel in Victoria Island, counting dollars in a plush robe and sipping champagne. The call came from Madrid. "The girl collapsed at the airport," said the voice on the other end. "2 of the wraps burst inside her." There was silence, heavy and thick. "She died in customs." Aisha didn't speak. She just stared at her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror. For a full minute, her face didn't change. Later that night, she made a quiet call to someone in Lagos who cleaned up such things. The girl's family was paid a small sum, a gesture of condolence wrapped in a lie. She had been trafficked unknowingly, the story would go. A victim, not a mule. The papers never picked it up. Another nameless tragedy in a continent full of them. Aisha felt nothing but a cold shift in the wind. From that moment on, she knew this business didn't forgive mistakes and it didn't mourn the weak. But the death made her smarter. She changed procedures, better packaging, stricter health checks, smaller loads. She began using coded language and burner phones, switching cars 3 times before reaching any meeting. Her couriers were now trained like soldiers, rehearsed for every question an immigration officer might ask. She studied cartel tactics, read books on psychology, and even consulted a former National Drug Law Enforcement Agency, NLDEA, officer turned informant. Knowledge, she realized, was deadlier than fear. Still, the girl's death stayed with her, not as guilt, but as a lesson. Aisha began sleeping with the lights on and carried a small blade in her purse, even to parties. She was becoming something else, hardened, sharper. In her world, currency was stained long before it reached your hands, and every bill she touched was soaked in invisible blood.
By the time Aisha turned 24, her name had traveled farther than her careers. In the underground world of Lagos, whispers of Madame Toriola passed between men in back rooms and women at beauty salons. Some said she had politicians in her pocket. Others believed she used black magic to blind the authorities. But the truth was simpler and more dangerous. Aisha was disciplined, invisible, and utterly unafraid. She didn't flaunt her wealth. She multiplied it. Her rise wasn't a loud explosion. It was a quiet, calculated invasion. She never smoked, rarely drank, and never used her own product. While other dealers got sloppy with pleasure, Aisha kept her mind sharp and her emotions colder than currency. She read people like ledgers, studying weaknesses, exploiting them, then discarding them like used wrappers. Her nickname among her couriers was the Baroness, a title she neither encouraged nor denied. Power was stronger when it didn't beg for acknowledgement. She began to invest in laundromats, salons, and boutique hotels across Lagos and Ibadan. Each one was a front, another layer between her and the law. But more than that, they were symbols, markers of her empire rising brick by brick in plain sight. Aisha no longer had to make the runs herself. She had drivers, accountants, and lawyers, each loyal or at least too afraid to betray her. At night, she would stand by her balcony, looking out at the city lights, a glass of water in hand. There was no joy, no laughter, just calculation. "I don't want to be rich," she once told a close associate. "I want to be untouchable." And with every successful shipment, every silenced whisper, and every corrupted official, Aisha Toriola was becoming just that, the untouchable Baroness of Lagos's criminal underworld. The first time she met Alhaji Musa Bello, known across Nigeria as Koko Fuji, was at a high society party in Lekki. The air throbbed with drums and saxophones, champagne flowed like water, and the rich laughed without consequence. Aisha arrived late, dressed in a floor-length wine-colored gown with no jewelry but confidence. Koko Fuji spotted her from the stage mid-performance. His voice stuttered, his eyes didn't. That night, he sent a bottle of Ace of Spades to her table with a handwritten note. A queen should never walk among shadows alone. What began as flirtation soon evolved into alliance. Koko was no stranger to the street. He'd grown up in the slums of Agege before fame crowned him. Their bond was forged in mutual understanding, two hustlers who had conquered their corners of the world. With Koko came access to the music scene, to elite parties, and more importantly, to the trust of powerful men who danced behind closed doors and did business in whispers. He introduced her to label owners, socialites, and state commissioners. Some were clients, some were carriers, others just wanted to be close to her mystique. But Aisha wasn't blinded by love. She knew men like Koko, powerful, charming, and disposable. Still, she let the relationship thrive so long as it served her empire. He sang about her in coded verses, calling her the woman of iron wrapped in velvet. The public thought it was poetry. Those who knew her story knew better. Her presence in the entertainment world grew, but it was more than glitz. It was strategy. Music traveled faster than money, and fame made her movements look normal. Who would suspect a woman dining with celebrities of running a drug empire? Aisha didn't just hide in the shadows anymore. She made them dance to her rhythm. London was colder than she expected. Not just the weather, but the people. Sharp suits, sharper words, and eyes that only saw profit. Aisha stepped into a Mayfair townhouse under the name Miss Ogunyemi, escorted by a man she only knew as Dapo. He was Yoruba, but spoke like a Cambridge scholar. He said, "This is the den," smirking as he held the door open. Inside there were no roars, but low murmurs, glasses clinking, and 5 figures seated around a mahogany table. British Yoruba, Lebanese, South African, Russian, and Dominican, each running networks across borders. Together, they formed the Quiet Council of the London Underground. They didn't shake hands, they evaluated. Aisha, at 26, was younger than anyone in the room, but she carried herself like someone born to command. She opened her tablet, showing figures, supply lines, maps of West African routes, customs vulnerabilities, and risk assessments. No hesitation, no fear. When she finished, silence followed. Then the Russian, known only as R, leaned back and said, "You think like a man, but move better than one. Welcome to the circle." That night, a new deal was struck. Aisha would manage all West African operations, streamlining heroin movement from Lagos to Europe using both commercial flights and diplomatic pouches via contacts she had cultivated in Nigerian embassies. In exchange, she would receive protection, weapons access, and a portion of the laundering rights in Amsterdam and Lisbon. It was everything she had wanted, but also the moment her empire became too large to vanish. As she left the townhouse, Dapo looked at her and said, "You know there's no going back now." Aisha didn't answer. She just pulled her coat tighter, walked into the London mist, and smiled. She wasn't scared. She was home, in the den, among dragons.
In December of 2002, the fantasy of invincibility cracked. It happened at Murtala Mohammed International Airport, of all places, the same ground where her legend had begun. One of her trusted couriers, a pregnant widow named Ronke, was stopped for a random bag check. She panicked. Within an hour, customs found more than 70 wraps of heroin stitched into the lining of her luggage. Under pressure, Ronke broke. She gave them a name, Madame Aisha. That was all it took. 2 days later, the National Drug Law Enforcement Agency, NDLEA, stormed one of Aisha's safe apartments in Surulere. She was arrested in her dressing gown, no makeup, barefoot. It was the first time in years anyone had seen her without her armor. The tabloids went wild. "Queen Pin caught," they screamed. Socialite or smuggler, her face plastered across front pages next to Coco Fuji's, who went silent overnight. Court became theater. The judge, a stern-faced man named Justice Jega, presided over the case as if aware the entire nation watched through invisible glass. Cameras weren't allowed, but every whisper in that courtroom leaked into saloons, radio shows, and beer parlors. Aisha stood tall throughout, never once looking defeated. When the charges were read, international drug trafficking, conspiracy, and money laundering, she only blinked once. But the system, as she already knew, was made of favors, debts, and backdoors. Her lawyers were sharks, expensive, ruthless, and well-connected. After 3 months of legal gymnastics, the impossible happened. Justice Jega granted her bail. Rumor had it he personally escorted her out of court to avoid her rearrest. Some swore they saw her exit in his own car. The whispers grew louder, but the facts disappeared. That day as she walked free, reporters shouted questions. Aisha only paused once to say, "Not all queens wear crowns. Some wear silence." The whispers didn't die after her release. They multiplied. How could a woman caught with such overwhelming evidence simply walk free? Some blamed the loopholes in Nigerian law. Others pointed fingers at the rot within the judiciary. But those who really knew Lagos's pulse said it was deeper than corruption. It was fear. Aisha Toriola had become more than a criminal. She had become a myth. And myths don't bow before laws. They bend them. Justice Jega's role became the epicenter of the controversy. Rumors flooded the media. Some claimed he owed his appointment to a senator Aisha once funded. Others insisted compromising photos exist, pictures from a private party in Banana Island, where judges, politicians, and smugglers
shared drinks under fairy lights. Whatever the truth was, Jega never spoke of it, and soon after the case, he requested a transfer to a quiet post in Sokoto, away from the flash bulbs and allegations. He faded from view like a character removed from the story he once ruled. For Aisha, the ordeal only deepened her legend. Her enemies saw the court as her Achilles heel. They were wrong. It had become her stage. When she returned to Lagos society, she wore white lace and gold heels, as if celebrating resurrection. No apologies, no explanations. She didn't have to. Her name, once whispered, now floated boldly in elite circles. She made sure to reward loyalty. The officers who kept quiet were promoted. The judge's niece received a scholarship. Her arrested courier, Ronke, was found a year later, living comfortably in Asaba, with a new name, new house, and no memory of anything that had ever happened. Aisha understood what most never grasped. In Nigeria, the law was not a barrier, it was a market, and every market had a price.
Amid the chaos of trials, shipments, and power games, there was a wound Aisha never spoke of, one that no courtroom or newspaper would ever uncover. It had happened years earlier, when she was just 19, barely a year into the business. She had fallen in love with a man named Ibrahim, a junior customs officer posted at Seme border. He had kind eyes and rough hands, and for a brief, impossible moment, Aisha imagined a life beyond smuggling. They met in secret, they whispered dreams under mosquito nets and plotted escapes they both knew were lies. When she found out she was pregnant, Ibrahim wept with joy. But joy wasn't enough to protect them. 3 weeks later, he was found dead on the Lagos-Badagry Expressway, 2 bullets in his chest, no witnesses, no investigation. The message was clear. Love had no place in her world. That night, she packed a small bag, bled silently, and took a taxi to Cotonou alone. She returned 2 weeks later without the baby and without tears. She buried both in silence. From then on, Aisha built walls inside herself. She would sleep with men, charm them, even pretend warmth when needed, but she never again allowed love to cross the threshold of her heart. When people asked why she never married, she laughed and said, "My empire is my husband," but only her closest aide, Ireti, ever saw her cry once a year on Ibrahim's birthday. In public, she remained the queen, but in private moments, when planes were delayed or phone lines went silent, she would sometimes touch her stomach just once, then pour another drink. No one suspected, no one dared ask, and so the lost baby became just another ghost in her growing kingdom of shadows. By the time she turned 28, Aisha Toriola had more identities than most diplomats. In a fireproof safe hidden behind a painting in her Lekki penthouse, she kept passports from 7 different countries: Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, the UK, Togo, Sierra Leone, and Liberia. Each bore a different name, each connected to a different story. One was a businesswoman named Amaka Edem, another a Senegalese fashion buyer. All of them were her, and none of them were real. She didn't just buy passports, she bought people. Low-level immigration staff, corrupt embassy workers, and tech-savvy interns in Abuja's Foreign Affairs Ministry all fell a system. With a single call, she could create an identity for a courier within 48 hours, birth certificate, voter's card, and bank history included. The forged documents were flawless. Aisha didn't tolerate sloppiness. She once had a forger flogged and exiled to Cotonou for producing a passport with a mismatched hologram. If the details don't protect us, then we are just criminals playing dress-up. But this web of ghost identities served more than convenience. It allowed her to move between countries unnoticed, to reroute shipments under foreign names, to open and close businesses that cleaned her money like holy water. She built a digital firewall around herself, so vast, even the NDLEA couldn't trace her movements accurately. Sometimes she would check into a hotel in Dubai as a Brazilian designer, fly to Nairobi as a UN researcher, and return to Lagos as a pregnant Sierra Leonean bride.
The authorities never caught up because the woman they were chasing didn't exist. To the world, Aisha Toriola was a ghost in designer heels, everywhere and nowhere at once. And that was how she liked it. Invisibility wasn't just her protection, it was her power.
Lagos never truly slept. It hummed. And in the silence between its horns and sirens, Aisha Toriola reigned like a silent monarch. On Friday nights, she would glide through the city in a black bulletproof SUV, flanked by 2 decoy vehicles. Her destinations were unpredictable. One night, a luxury penthouse in Ikoyi. The next, a late-night jazz club in Victoria Island, or a yacht party off the Lekki coastline. Wherever she went, the atmosphere shifted. The air thickened. Eyes followed. Conversations paused. People knew better than to ask questions when the Baroness arrived. But Lagos nightlife wasn't just recreation for Aisha. It was business. These parties were laced with informal deals. Politicians, entertainers, socialites, and foreign investors danced in dim lights, sipping vintage cognac while making promises over glass. And Aisha was always in the middle, laughing just enough, listening more. She didn't just entertain Lagos's elite, she curated their desires, supplying drugs, protection, and sometimes secrets that could make or break careers. Her influence was more intoxicating than anything she smuggled. Yet, beneath the glamour, Aisha never let her guard down. She knew the city was full of spies, ex-lovers turned moles, journalists in disguise, and desperate people who would sell her out for a visa. That's why she employed watchers, men and women who blended into crowds and reported everything. They sent her photos, transcripts of drunken confessions, and secret footage of her enemies' private scandals. She weaponized the city's vanity, turning whispers into leverage. One night, while overlooking the lagoon from a rooftop party, a senator leaned in and whispered, "You've become the most powerful woman in Lagos, and no one voted for you." Aisha smiled, but said nothing. She didn't need votes. Power in Lagos didn't come from ballots. It came from fear, loyalty, and silence. For years, Aisha prided herself on knowing everything before it happened. Every new recruit, every shift in airport patrol schedules, every hushed conversation in commissioner lounges. She had ears in all corners. But she didn't see him coming. Not Bodhi. Not the boy she pulled from the slums of Bariga, cleaned up, trained, and turned into her most trusted driver. He had been loyal, or so she believed. He knew her roots, her aliases, and her habits. She even let him drive her daughter, Amina, to school on rare occasions. That was how deep her trust went. And that was her mistake. It started with inconsistencies, a delayed pickup here, a vague excuse there. Aisha's instincts, finely honed from years of deception, tingled. She began watching him, silently. Then came the confirmation. One of her IT men intercepted a string of encrypted messages sent from Bude's second phone. He was feeding details to the NDLEA, routes, names, storage addresses. The betrayal stung, not just for what it was, but because it had come from within. Rather than explode in rage, Aisha played it cold. She let Bude believe he was still invisible. She even gave him a bonus, told him he was her most reliable hand. Then one evening, she sent him on a routine pickup in Badagry. He never returned. The next morning, his car was found abandoned near a swamp, empty. No blood, nobody. Just gone. To the world, it was just another Lagos mystery. But inside her circle, the message was clear. Betrayal would vanish without echo. Aisha tightened her circle, changed her routes, and replaced her entire courier team within 2 weeks. From that moment on, trust was no longer assumed. It had to be earned, bought, and constantly surveilled. She had learnt a lesson. Sometimes your shadows betray you, so you become darker than them.
It was supposed to be routine. Aisha had prepared every detail of the operation. Another courier, another airport, another hidden route. This time, she wasn't even directly involved. Or so she thought. The plan was to move a shipment of heroin through a new contact in Port Harcourt, someone she believed had been properly vetted. But on November 14th, 2007, everything unraveled. Her courier, a 21-year-old university dropout named Mabel, was stopped during a secondary security screening at Murtala Muhammad Airport. Unbeknownst to Aisha, NDLEA had tapped into her burner line weeks before, tracing connections she had long since thought severed. Mabel cracked under pressure, confessing within hours. But it wasn't just Mabel. The agency had been building a case for months, monitoring shipments, surveilling properties, and interviewing former mules who were offered deals in exchange for testimony. This time, Aisha's name came up too often to ignore. When they came for her, it was different from the first arrest. There were no early morning knocks or polite warrants. NDLEA stormed her Lekki residence with a warrant, drones overhead, media tipped off for maximum spectacle. Aisha was handcuffed in her Versace robe, cameras flashing, headlines already writing themselves. Drug queen captured again, the paper screamed. And this time, the evidence was damning. Financial trails, warehouse footage, and intercepted calls. She was taken to a maximum security holding cell. No bail this time. The prosecutors were younger, more determined. They had made her downfall a mission, not a case. Inside the grey walls of her cell, Aisha sat in silence. No lawyers yet, no messages from her network, just the ticking sound of isolation. But if they thought she was broken, they misunderstood the kind of storm she was. This wasn't the end, it was an intermission. And Aisha Toriola never stayed caged for long. They gave her a new nickname inside the prison, Alhaja of Smoke, a tribute or perhaps a mockery of the rumors that Aisha could vanish like vapor in any situation. And while she couldn't disappear this time, she moved through the prison walls like royalty among commoners. Within days, the guards treated her differently. She ate better meals, wore cleaner uniforms, and had access to news from the outside. Even in custody, Aisha negotiated influence like currency. It wasn't freedom, but it was something close. Her lawyers worked round the clock, filing appeals, requesting adjournments, challenging the legitimacy of the arrest process. Meanwhile, her lieutenant on the outside went into damage control, burning files, relocating assets, shifting accounts to new names in Mauritius and Dubai. Aisha had built her empire with redundancies. She had always planned for collapse. This arrest wasn't the death of her operation, it was a stress test. What made it different this time wasn't the legal threat, it was her health. During a routine checkup, the prison nurse found a lump. 2 weeks later, it was confirmed. Ovarian cancer, early but aggressive. The diagnosis hit her harder than the cuffs ever did. Her body, always her tool, her weapon, was now her betrayer. Her lawyers petitioned for medical bail. The state resisted, arguing she was a flight risk. But behind closed doors, deals were made. Certain officials were reminded of past favors. Others were promised future ones. And within 3 months, Aisha was granted a temporary medical release. She left the prison compound wrapped in a black veil, flanked by armed escorts and doctors. People expected her to flee. Instead, she stayed. She went straight to a private hospital in Victoria Island and began treatment. Aisha knew she was still in the fight, only now the battle was against both justice and her own body.
The clinic was quiet, almost too quiet. Hidden behind tall hedges in Victoria Island and run by a discreet French-Nigerian oncologist, it had no signage, no receptionist desk, and no visible security. But inside, it was a fortress of care and secrets. Here, the wealthy and the damned came to fight their most private wars. It was here Aisha Toriola became something she had never allowed herself to be: vulnerable. The treatments were brutal. Chemotherapy left her weak, dizzy, and often silent for hours. Her once glossy hair thinned, her skin dulled, and her appetite vanished. For the first time in her adult life, she couldn't control her own body. But she refused to let anyone but her nurse see her cry. When visitors came, and they always came, from politicians' wives to high-ranking officers, she wore her silk scarf, applied eyeliner, and spoke as if she were merely nursing a fever. No one could see the cracks. Not even Amina, her daughter, who was flown in from Ghana boarding school once a month, allowed only an hour with her mother. But the illness didn't stop her mind from working. Aisha converted one of the clinic rooms into a temporary operations base. Laptops were set up, phones secured. Her assistant Ireti managed all communications. From her hospital bed, she revised routes, approved bribes, and restructured career teams. Her empire didn't shrink, it simply evolved. The staff began to call her the witch in room 4, not out of malice, but awe. How could a dying woman still run a syndicate that spanned 3 continents? How could someone so close to the grave remain this dangerous? Aisha had one answer. She whispered it to herself during sleepless nights, between injections and vomit and pain. I am not afraid of death. I am only afraid of dying without power. Aisha had always kept Amina at a distance, not out of neglect, but out of strategy. Children don't belong in shadows, she once told her assistant Ireti. From the moment she gave birth in a private South African clinic under the name Ruth Osei, she had planned Amina's life down to the final stitch. Elite boarding schools, dual citizenship, and a carefully fabricated family tree. Amina believed her mother was a wealthy textile investor, rarely home because of business in Dubai. But what she didn't know was that the empire paying for her school uniforms had been built on silence, betrayal, and heroin. But now, as cancer drained the illusion of time, Aisha felt the pull of unfinished truth. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, Aisha asked Ireti to bring Amina to the clinic. It wasn't one of the usual short, staged visits. This time, the girl, now 15 and curious, was allowed into her mother's private chamber. Aisha wore no scarf. Her shaved head, pale skin, and sunken cheeks revealed the cost of power. Amina paused at the door, stunned. "Mama," she whispered, for the first time unsure. For the next hour, Aisha told her a vision of the truth, curated but honest enough to draw blood. She spoke of her childhood in Mushin, of choices made, of things sacrificed. She didn't mention heroin or murder or prisons, but she did say, "I did what I had to do to protect you, to give you what I never had." Amina listened, her eyes never leaving her mother's face. When the nurse came to end the visit, the girl hugged her mother, tight, long, as if she were trying to hold on to something slipping between her fingers. Later that night, Aisha cried alone for the first time in years. Power had made her untouchable, but motherhood had made her human again. By the beginning of 2009, Aisha knew her body was losing the battle, even if her empire wasn't. The chemo had taken her hair, her weight, and some of her memory. But her instincts remained sharp. And when one of her rivals, a Ghanaian syndicate known as the Onyx Circle, began undercutting her route through Senegal, she knew she had to make one final move, one final shipment, a declaration, a reminder to everyone watching that she was still the queen, even from a hospital bed. She called it Operation Silence. It involved 3 couriers, 2 planes, and a diplomatic crate disguised as cultural artifacts headed to Amsterdam. The shipment was estimated to bring in over $2.4 million in pure profit. More importantly, it would send a message to her enemies. Aisha Toriola was still untouchable. She coordinated it all from a hospital room where morphine drips and email pings worked in tandem. Ireti, her ever-loyal lieutenant, handled ground logistics. The shipment left Lagos without issue. But something went wrong in Amsterdam. One of the diplomatic crates was flagged during a random cultural inspection, a rare occurrence triggered not by a snitch, but by a bored customs official who noticed inconsistencies in the crate's paperwork. The heroin was discovered. 2 of the couriers were arrested immediately. The third went missing, presumed flipped by authorities. It was a breach unlike any she'd faced. For the first time in years, her name was spoken again by international agencies, this time with renewed urgency. Back in Lagos, Aisha received the news in silence. No anger, no panic, just cold analysis. She'd made a miscalculation, possibly her last. Her empire wouldn't crumble overnight, but the cracks were now public. Her myth had been wounded. She looked out the clinic window and whispered, "If this is the end, let it be loud." It wasn't the NDLE. It wasn't the Amsterdam customs officer. It wasn't even the missing courier. The real betrayal came from inside. The one place Aisha thought was bulletproof. Ireti, her right hand, her shadow for nearly a decade, had made a deal. In exchange for immunity, witness protection, and a small offshore account in the Cayman Islands, Ireti had handed over names, dates, and critical data logs tied to Operation Silence. The betrayal wasn't fueled by ambition. It was fear that when Aisha died, the empire would crumble and the knives would turn inward. Ireti chose survival. Aisha found out the same way she discovered most things, through whispers in the underground. A low-level associate called in panic. "Madam, Ireti don't talk. She don't sell you full report e dey for EFCC hand." At first, Aisha refused to believe it. Ireti, the girl she had trusted to bury bodies, move millions, lie without blinking. But the evidence was too detailed. Only someone on the inside could have exposed that much. The final confirmation came when Ireti disappeared. No calls, no trace. Her apartment in Ikeja was empty. Her family unreachable. She was gone, vanished like a ghost in the wind, but not without leaving damage. 2 of her front companies were seized. One of her bank accounts in Luxembourg was frozen. Even a small warehouse in Badagry had been raided and torched. The betrayal didn't break Aisha. It refined her rage into something sharper. She ordered the remaining staff to burn every remaining weak link. Operations were downsized, meetings moved offline, and only blood-sworn loyalists were allowed into her room. She told one of her lieutenants, "We built this from the ground, and we can build it again, but traitors must pay, even if I have to collect their debt from the grave." She knew then her empire would survive, but her trust
never would.
Despite her cancer and the cracks in her empire, Aisha was still living like royalty. Only now, the palace was a prison of her own making. The clinic in Victoria Island, once a haven, had become her golden cage. She couldn't leave the compound without risking arrest. The government hadn't forgotten Operation Silence, and her name was once again circulating through the intelligence channels of Interpol, the NDLEA, and even the EFCC. But strangely, they hadn't made their move yet. Some believed they were watching, waiting. Others said they feared the backlash of arresting a living legend. Inside, the staff bowed to her presence. Her suite smelled of fresh flowers and imported oils. Visitors were screened twice before entering. And yet, in this palace of polished wood and soft jazz, Aisha was more alone than ever. No Ireti, no calls from Koko Fuji, who had long distanced himself to protect his career. Even her daughter Amina, now back in school abroad, wrote less frequently. Her letters sweet but distant, like postcards from another life. It was in this isolation that Aisha began to feel the silken chains of her power. She had always ruled in silence, but now silence ruled her. Every day was a routine. Blood work, injections, hushed phone calls, watching the lagoon from her window. She couldn't flee. She couldn't rebuild. She couldn't fully trust anyone. Her kingdom still stood, but she could no longer walk its streets. One night, she sat by the window, wrapped in a silk robe, tracing raindrops down the glass. "This is what kings become," she whispered. "Not martyrs, not saints, just statues wrapped in silk, waiting to be forgotten." She smiled bitterly at her reflection. Even legends, she now understood, could be trapped in gold, in sickness, in their own legacy. His name was Daniel Eweye, young, ambitious, and reckless enough to go after ghosts. A freelance journalist with a growing reputation for exposing corrupt politicians and untouchable tycoons. He had once covered corporate oil thefts in the Niger Delta. But his next story aimed higher. The untold empire of Aisha Toriola. It started with curiosity, then obsession. Why had no one been able to bring her down? Why were there no public photos post-2005? Why did the NDLEA hesitate? He began tracing her story through court transcripts, shipping logs, and whispers from her former careers. Slowly, he stitched together a timeline, grainy photos, confiscated passports, and interviews with ex-partners and law enforcement officials who refused to go on record. Each clue led him deeper into the myth of the Baroness, and then he found it. A contact in Amsterdam who had once laundered money for her network. The man gave him one name, a location, Victoria Island Clinic, room 4. Daniel posed as a health blogger profiling cancer treatment centers for elite patients. His credentials, forged and flawless, earned him a 10-minute visit. When he stepped into the room, he didn't find a monster. He found a woman in a scarf, eyes sharp despite her fragile frame, surrounded by silence and flowers. He introduced himself. She studied him for a full minute before speaking. "You are not a health writer," she said flatly. "No," he admitted. She could have called security. Instead, she poured tea. "So you want my story? Tell me, Daniel, do you want the truth or the myth?" He hesitated. "Both." Aisha leaned back, a sly smile curving her lips. "Then sit down. I've never needed a biographer until now." And just like that, she began to tell her tale.
Not for justice, not for redemption, but for control.
Over the next few weeks, Daniel returned to room 4 again and again, each time under stricter secrecy. Aisha allowed only him, no recorders, no cameras. He was given a simple notepad and a promise. You'll get my story, but only on my terms. She spoke in fragments, never linear, often drifting between present and past like a spirit tethered to memory. He wrote furiously, capturing every detail, every cryptic metaphor. She rarely said drugs or heroin. She preferred words like cargo, gift, and songs too heavy for customs to understand. What Daniel realized quickly was that Aisha wasn't just confessing crimes. She was curating a legacy. She spoke of betrayals with chilling calm, of couriers who disappeared, of judges who kissed her hand in chambers before sentencing others. She named names, some dead, some too powerful to touch. He asked if she ever regretted anything. She paused once and said, I regret nothing except not learning French. It would have made the Paris deals easier. In those late-night sessions, a strange intimacy developed. Daniel, the hunter, became something else, perhaps a witness, perhaps a scribe, maybe even a pawn. But he didn't care. He knew this story would define his career or end it. One night, she gave him a box, a black lacquered case with velvet lining. Inside were memory cards, printed ledgers, and old passports. These are for when I stop speaking, she said. They'll finish what I start. Daniel asked her why she was telling him all this. Why now? Because dying without a narrative is just vanishing. And I won't vanish. I will haunt. He walked out that night with the box under his arm and a knot in his chest. He wasn't sure if he had just documented the life of a criminal or the blueprint of a queen. It began just before dawn, swift, silent, surgical. A convoy of black SUVs and masked officers from a joint NDLEA and EFCC task force stormed 3 locations simultaneously: Aisha's Lekki residence, a warehouse in Badagry, and the clinic on Victoria Island. For weeks, agents had studied Daniel's movements, intercepted encrypted calls, and followed traces left behind by Ireti's confession. With warrants signed in Abuja and the quiet green light from Interpol, they made their move, knowing it would either end the legacy or trigger a firestorm. At the clinic, nurses screamed as officers burst through the main entrance. Aisha was in the middle of a blood transfusion. She didn't flinch. When the head agent stormed into room 4 and barked, "You are under arrest," she merely looked up, the corners of her mouth curling faintly. "You took your time," she said, removing her IV with a shaky hand. They handcuffed her, frail and regal, wrapped in a silk robe. A camera caught the moment. It made front pages around the world. In Lekki, safes were cracked open, ledgers seized, banner phones collected. In Badagry, crates were found hidden behind walls, currency, ledgers, expired passports, and even a few unprocessed parcels of heroin sealed in rubber. It was the largest coordinated raid in NDLEA history. Officers posed for photos like they'd captured a terrorist, but deep inside, they knew they hadn't broken the empire. They'd only shaken its crown. That night, social media exploded. Hashtag Aisha Toriola trended for days. News anchors speculated endlessly. Was this the fall of Nigeria's most elusive queen, or just another chapter in a longer war? Back in her cell, Aisha watched the headlines from a grainy television. She smiled, tired but amused. "They think it's over," she whispered, "but the queen never exits without applause."
The courtroom was colder than she remembered, larger too, or maybe that was just the weight of the nation's eyes upon her. Aisha Toriola, the Baroness, now thin as bone and dressed in prison beige, was no longer an enigma. She was evidence, narrative, spectacle. The prosecutor opened with a voice of fire, listing her crimes like verses from scripture: trafficking, money laundering, obstruction, conspiracy. Every word echoed through the hall like a nail in her legacy's coffin. But then came the twist. In a surprising turn, Aisha's defense entered emotion, proffer of cooperation. She was willing to talk, not for leniency, she claimed, but for leverage. "I built an empire," she said calmly during her testimony, "and I can dismantle it in one breath." The room shifted. Phones buzzed. Reporters scribbled. She named offshore accounts, exposed international routes through West Africa, and provided digital proof of partnerships between cartel bosses and political figures. It wasn't just redemption, it was nuclear. Some called it cowardice, others said it was strategy, a final play by a woman who had always stayed 2 moves ahead. She framed it differently. You want justice? Fine, but let's make sure it's complete. Her cooperation sent tremors through West Africa's underworld. Within weeks, several mid-tier smugglers were arrested. An aviation officer in Cotonou disappeared. A sitting senator in Nigeria resigned without explanation. Back in prison, inmates began calling her Mama Justice, a name laced with irony but not mockery. Even behind bars, she had more influence than most people on the outside. But Aisha wasn't done. At night, she drafted something else, a letter addressed to Amina, sealed and marked for when the time is right. It wasn't a confession, it wasn't a goodbye, it was instructions.
After her courtroom testimony, Aisha Toriola vanished from public view. Officially, she was transferred to a federal correctional facility outside Abuja under special medical conditions. Unofficially, no one knew where she was. Journalists who tried to trace her were met with sealed files, redirected calls, and ominous warnings. The NDLEA refused to comment. The EFCC went silent, and the Ministry of Justice denied she was ever part of a witness protection agreement. But whispers continued. Some claimed she had been moved to a secure government facility in Jos, far from the coast and her former strongholds. Others said she had died shortly after her final testimony and was buried under a false name to avoid martyrdom. A few swore she had negotiated her exit entirely, granted asylum in an undisclosed African country in exchange for dismantling the smuggling networks she once commanded. The truth remained elusive. Back in Lagos, the empire she'd built fractured but never collapsed. Her lieutenants scattered, rebranded and adapted. Her offshore accounts had been frozen, but only the ones she had revealed. Others remained untouched, funding unknown futures. Some former allies fled to Europe, others disappeared into the sprawl of the continent, but her legend remained. Murals appeared on inner city walls in Mushin, silhouettes of a woman in a headscarf with the words, "She vanished, not defeated." Daniel, the journalist, tried for months to reach her. His book was nearly finished, but its ending felt incomplete. Then one day, he received a small envelope delivered by an unknown courier. No return address. Inside was a note in clean, steady handwriting. Some queens rule with fear, others with fire. I chose silence. Finish the story, Daniel. But know this, legends don't die, they just change names. And with that, the Baroness returned to where she had always thrived, in the shadows. Long after the headlines faded, Aisha Toriola's name remained etched in the criminal folklore of West Africa. To the old guard, she was a cautionary tale. To the rising generation, she was a blueprint. And to those who truly understood the world she ruled, she was a legend, one who mastered systems that refused to hold her.
But even legends leave traces, and Aisha had made sure of that. Years after her disappearance, investigators still found fingerprints of her empire in strange places. A dormant logistics company in Accra receiving phantom shipments. A small NGO in Dakar suddenly flush with untraceable funds. A jewelry boutique in Dubai quietly purchasing real estate under pseudonyms. Though her lieutenant has scattered, the structure she built still posts in the arteries of global commerce. Silent, invisible, alive. The letter she wrote to Amina remained unopened, locked in a vault in Zurich under strict release instructions. No one knew its contents, not even Daniel, who had since turned her story into an international bestseller. The Queen Without a Throne topped charts, earned awards, and haunted him with the sense that he had only scratched the surface. At readings, people asked him the same question: what happened to her? He always replied the same: she disappeared, but I don't think she's gone. Meanwhile, in Ghana, Amina turned 21. Poised, articulate, and sharp-eyed like her mother, she graduated top of her class in economics and was offered roles in international development. But she kept her distance from the spotlight. She was never seen in interviews, never appeared at award ceremonies. To her, the world felt like a puzzle, one she was starting to see through. The day she received the Zurich key by courier, her fingers trembled. Not from fear, from recognition. Smoke, after all, doesn't vanish. It just waits for the wind. The Zurich vault was deep, cold and silent. Amina stood in the heart of it, holding the envelope her mother had written nearly 3 years before. It was cream-colored, unmarked, and sealed with red wax. No name, no instructions, but her initials in her mother's hand, A.T. She sat down at a small desk beneath the vault's surveillance cameras, opened it and unfolded the letter. It wasn't long. Aisha never needed many words to move empires, but each line was sharp, deliberate. If you are reading this, then you have heard the myths. Ignore them. My real legacy isn't the drugs or the money. It's the system. I built something that doesn't need me to breathe. It needs only a mind strong enough to shape it. The letter contained instructions, accounts, passwords, code phrases, dormant operations disguised as abandoned businesses. There were names of trusted operatives still in place, men and women who had pledged loyalty to Aisha, now waiting for her heir. Amina read every line, her heart pounding like a drum in a silent church. Her mother hadn't just left her a fortune, she had left her a throne. A week later, a private jet landed in Cotonou. A woman stepped out, tall, dark-skinned, with a commanding stillness about her. No press, no noise. She was escorted to a compound formerly registered as a textile import firm. Inside, 5 men stood waiting. One of them, a scarred man in his 50s, stepped forward. Alhaja, we've been expecting you. Amina said nothing. She walked past them, took her place at the head of the table and opened the briefcase she had brought. Inside, her mother's letter, a burner phone, and a single silver necklace engraved with the initials A.T. The Baroness hadn't vanished. She had returned with a new face, a new name, and the same fire.
It began slowly. Ripples beneath still water. A defunct transport company in Togo suddenly resumed operations. A frozen account in Kenya was quietly reactivated. 2 couriers who had once worked for Aisha Toriola received encrypted messages from unknown numbers, each message containing the same phrase: "The Queen watches, the wind moves again." Within months, whispers emerged from the underworld. Familiar roots were reappearing, former loyalists were being contacted, and the old codes were returning, not as relics, but as signals. But this time, the figure behind it wasn't a war-hardened woman with silk scarves and steel eyes. It was Amina. And she wasn't rebuilding the past, she was redesigning the future. Where her mother had ruled through intimidation and reputation, Amina worked through silence and precision. She used data, digital currencies, shell corporations with AI-generated CEOs, and logistics routed through virtual networks that couldn't be traced by even the most advanced cyber forensic teams. The empire wasn't returning to its old form. It was mutating into something smarter, something deadlier. Daniel, now back in Lagos, sensed the shift. A surge in offshore financial activity, the sudden reappearance of old smuggling patterns, it all pointed to one thing. Someone had picked up Aisha's crown. He filed a report, unpublished, titled The Queen's Ghost. In it, he speculated that Aisha had planned this succession all along, that her greatest act wasn't her escape or her empire, but her daughter. And in a private compound in Ghana, Amina sat in a minimalist office lit only by a laptop screen. On it were moving dots, real-time tracking of cargo shipments through Africa, Europe, and the Middle East. She leaned back in her chair and smiled, not out of pride, but purpose. The crown had never fallen. It had simply passed hands, and the new queen of shadows had risen.